If you're somebody who's pretty active online, you've probably heard of DMCA, and specifically Dmca Takedowns. Most of you might be familiar with this from YouTube. Whenever you have a YouTube video that has some copyright infringing content, you see a Dmca takedown, and essentially these videos get taken down by YouTube's content ID system or something of that nature if they're not manually taken down. Well, lately DMCA has been particularly prevalent with Twitch. Twitch is a streaming platform where people essentially have live streams of their gameplay and daily lives, and specifically there's been a recent trend of Twitch streamers streaming full TV shows or movies and reacting to them. And reacting, I'm kind of using that phrase generously here because in some cases they're simply sitting there and essentially playing a TV show or a movie in its entirety. So it's hard to see how that would be fair use, given they're not really giving much commentary and they're pretty much playing the whole thing, thus replacing that in the market. Recently, it seems some of these bigger companies such as Viacom and Fox have essentially started coming after these Twitch streamers who have been streaming these full television programs. Particularly here, you'll see the story I'm using as an example is the Twitch streamer Pokimane, who received her first Twitch ban because of streaming Avatar: The Last Airbender cartoon. Pokimane was watching this episode live, and then she received a live DMCA ban. And I believe this was because someone manually filed a DMCA notice to take down the content. So an interesting thing about this article here that I'm looking at while we're talking about Twitch streamers using various content, you'll see here it says, I can see at least half a dozen streamers in the just chatting category watching old animated shows and wrestling events. Of course, almost all of this content is owned by large companies who usually aren't too keen on random people broadcasting their copyrighted material, so it's not shocking that even a big streamer like Pokimane would encounter some legal pushback in the form of a DMCA ban for streaming TV shows. And to give some background of what these Twitch streamers have been doing is watch these videos live with thousands of people watching with them, and they then delete the VODs, which are the recordings of their live streams. So there's really no evidence of this happening. They removed the option for clips to be made, so you can't make little clips of their streams. So if you're a big company like Fox, it's really hard for you to even detect that someone is infringing on your copyrights. Oftentimes these lawyers who are dealing with tracking copyright infringement, they're often pretty behind in terms of when something's infringing, unless they're actively looking for it. So let's say you have a new movie coming out. Let's say you have a new Spider-Man movie coming out, and then there's someone leaks the whole movie on YouTube. You're probably on the lookout for stuff like that, so you'll be quicker to shut that down. And that's a true story. Something like that did happen. I believe it was up for a few days before whoever Sony was able to take it down. But for something such as old TV programs, and specifically old TV programs because they might not have an active enforcement team looking out for infringement because the program's no longer really lucrative. So in cases such as that, such as Avatar, you might not have lawyers looking out for this kind of infringement. And if you don't have the evidence up, they had to have been watching live, or someone must have tipped them off for them to actually file a manual DMCA claim. But now that they filed one and filed another one for MasterChef, a different company, now you're starting to see sort of a trend that these companies are probably going to be actively looking out. They might have an intern or paralegal looking at these platforms live just to look at who's streaming what and then file live DMCAs. So some background. The reason DMCA was created was because Congress was sort of fearful the internet, which was still uncertain at that point, would never be able to really expand or form if various internet service providers would get shut down because someone on their site posted something that was infringing copyright, which is why DMCA created this sort of safe harbor. So the safe harbor shields online service providers from infringement claims made against them based on the conduct of their customers or users. So Twitter, let's say you have Twitter, you have all these users. Twitter itself isn't posting content. So if someone has something that infringes copyright, you can't sue Twitter personally for the actions of one of its millions and millions of users. So how do you take advantage of these safe harbor provisions? Well, the first requirement is you have to designate a copyright agent to receive takedown notices. You have to adopt and communicate to users an effective copyright infringement policy. And number 3, you have to properly comply with the takedown notices when received. So there's a whole procedure of how you're supposed to handle takedown notices. Well, we'll get right into that. But first, let me also briefly mention what the process is for filing a DMCA takedown notice. So first, you receive notice. So let's say you see someone infringing your copyright on YouTube, you file a notice, and basically the rights holder sends a notice to the online service provider. So you send a notice to YouTube saying someone's infringing my content. Then YouTube has to remove that content from their platform. YouTube then has to notify the user who uploaded the infringing video, and then the user has an option to, okay, accept the fact that their video is taken down, or they can file a counter notice, and then YouTube has to restore access to that material. So it has to re-upload the video, and that has to happen no less than 10 days and no more than 14 business days after the material is taken down or after you receive that counter notice, unless the original notice sender informs the service provider that it has filed a court action against the user. So if you think someone's taken down your video in bad faith and you file a counter notice, they're probably not going to file a court action. It's sort of like a bluff. They're saying, hey, take this down or else we're suing you. Then you file a counter notice and then you say, go ahead, sue me. Well, then they have to sue you. If they don't sue you, YouTube can't keep that video down. So here you have the US code and the section that basically addresses all of this DMCA stuff. Let's get into what some of the requirements are for a platform like Twitch. So here's one. You have to have a designated agent. So the limitations on liability established in this subsection apply to a service provider only if the service provider has designated an agent to receive notifications of claimed infringement. So you basically have to have someone to whom a copyright owner can send DMCA takedowns. So what are some other requirements here? Accommodation of technology. Platforms have to have some kind of policy for terminating repeat offenders. If someone keeps infringing on someone's copyright, you have to essentially have a policy that terminates their access to the platform entirely. And this is something we're going to look at with Twitch specifically, because Twitch has a policy of 3 strikes and you're out. You have a permanent ban on your account after 3 DMCA strikes. So let's look at Twitch's policy and see if they're complying with this DMCA process. So here's the first thing we mentioned, a repeat infringer policy. So under our policy, a user will be considered a repeat infringer if they accrue 3 copyright strikes. And number 2, here we have the designated copyright agent. So this is the person you have to contact. Here you have an email account that allows the DMCA process to flow quickly. So one additional thing I want to mention is that fair use should be considered by the copyright owners before they file a DMCA takedown. And this creates some additional liability for the copyright owners, because if these companies don't consider fair use when it's a clear fair use, they could be liable for damages themselves and attorney's fees and certain penalties for misrepresenting their DMCA takedown. And why is that tricky? Well, if you've seen some of my other videos, you know fair use is very subjective. Different people can completely disagree on whether something is fair use. In other words, someone could think it's a closed case, someone could think it's an open and shut case. Fair use is all over the map and no one knows which way it's going to go. Except when you have Twitch streamers streaming entire episodes of MasterChef, I think that's a pretty clear example of something that's copyright infringement and not fair use. I think what we have here is there's going to be a complete change for how Twitch handles these DMCA takedowns. They might even revise their policy to have permanent bans after maybe only 1 or 2 strikes instead of 3 strikes. So there's sort of a dangerous mentality with Twitch streamers. A lot of them think that if they don't have 3 strikes, they're fine to infringe content because they still have leeway until they accrue those 3 strikes. But the reality is a company can sue any of these streamers whether they have strikes or not, whether they have a DMCA takedown or not. The takedown notice system is a safe harbor for Twitch and for platforms. It isn't a safe harbor for the users. It isn't a safe harbor for the content creators such as Pokimane. Only time will tell how companies will handle this, but once the story gets out there, every in-house legal department is going to say, well, is our content being streamed on Twitch? Let's start sending DMCA notices left and right. This might be a sticky situation for a lot of these Twitch streamers, and I do not envy being in their position, but it is something they should have been aware of, and it is pretty cut and dry if you look at the law as far as copyright infringement.